And Sarah, those are for slide 7.
Shall I start? All right, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our discussion about cultivating a community of practice for new supervisors. My name is Andrea Malone, and I'm the coordinator of research services at the University of Houston.
And I'm Veronica Arellano Douglas. I'm the instruction coordinator, also at the University of Houston.
And I'm Lisa Martin, formerly at the University of Houston, but currently the Assistant Program Director for Instruction Services at the University of California, San Diego.
So before we begin today, we wanted to share some information about ways that you can contribute, if you are able and so moved, to collective action efforts in and around Houston. I'm sure you all had seen this on the news recently. The entire state experienced a really terrible winter storm, and the effects of the storm were made even worse by an inept electricity oversight group, failing infrastructure in the state, and our government's inaction. So again, if you're so moved and able, here are a few local and national organizations that have local efforts in Houston. They could always use assistance. And some of these groups in particular are still offering clean water and food and assistance paying electricity bills for folks in and around Houston and throughout the state. So we just wanted to throw that out there, and we'll be sharing our slides later so that if you want to come back to some of these organizations, you can do so.
Today, we want to focus on three things. The first is the value of a community of practice for new managers and supervisors. The second is our experience with what to do and what not to do in a community of practice. And finally, we want to provide the tools and space to create your own community of practice if you so desire. And we hope by the end of today's session that you are interested in doing so. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat throughout the session. We will address questions in the moment if we can, and we have also left space at the end in order to answer questions as well. So with that, we want to move into providing everyone with a common definition for community of practice in order to provide a foundation for our conversation today. The definition that we're using is on the screen, and I'm also going to read it out loud. Communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. That definition is from Wenger and Trainer, and we've got that link in the chat, or we will shortly. And we've also got references at the end if you want to go ahead and follow through. It's important to note that a community of practice usually has three parts: the domain, the community, and the practice. The domain is that shared area of concern or passion, which could be as broad as librarianship if you want to include public librarians in your community of practice, or you could call it something like libraries if you wanted to include other library workers, or as narrow as academic library middle management. Community is the group who are the learners and practitioners together. And that practice is about taking the resources that you've gained from the community, putting it into action, and interacting afterwards to reflect and grow as a group together.
So with that foundational definition, we'll discuss the purpose and logistics of our community practice and share what a typical meetup looked like for us. So let's first talk about why we did this. In my nearly 15 years at University of Houston, there have been several restructures of the Liaison Services Department, which has always been the department with the largest number of librarians. As the department grew over the years, a single department head managing all of those librarians became a bit too much. And so then we shifted to this structure where we had two department heads. And every time people would hear about that, they thought it was strange, but it really did work for us. And then after some time, both of those department heads got new opportunities. And so time came for us to change once again. So we went back to having a single department head, but this also presented an opportunity to create new managing coordinator positions, which the three of us took on. And with these new roles came our community of practice made up of just the three of us.
So our department had previous experience with communities of practice. We created an emotional intelligence and leadership community of practice in 2016 that was very popular with the department. And that community of practice eventually widened its focus, its emphasis to include diversity, equity, inclusion as well. We use the book, Cultivating Communities of Practice, which we can post a link in the chat, as a guide. We also later wrote an article, Creating an Emotional Intelligence Community of Practice, a case study for academic libraries. And this was by my colleague, Christina Gola and I. And we referenced other libraries creating communities of practice within that article. And of course, you may have noticed that our keynote on Monday mentioned an expertise in communities of practice as well. So there's a lot of resources out there if you're interested in finding out more details about how a library might create a community of practice. All of that is to say, we believed in communities of practice and we knew the value of getting together as a deliberate community.
So in creating our own space, we each had our own mentors, but also met individually with our department head and in supervisor meetings that included the three of us with the department head. However, even with all of those meetings, we recognized the need to have our own space where we could be vulnerable, share ideas and strategies, and sometimes just vent. Um, our community practice gave us time to openly express our feelings or frustrations without administrative oversight or interference. Respond to and provide support for one another, but also to celebrate successes and wins we experienced. So this sense of community we were building helped us to realize that we were not alone in this. Though we came with different experiences and became managers of teams with unique purposes and membership, we were all first-time managers that shared connection, and that shared connection was really comforting to us.
So one of the other things that we all needed most as new supervisors was perspective. You know, Andrea talked about needing community. Now their roles had shifted. And of course, that community is super important, but we also needed folks that could be honest with us and who we could be honest with in turn. So we wanted colleagues we could feel safe opening up to and ask for advice, but we also needed those colleagues to be real with us and hold us accountable because we recognized this was our, first supervisory position and we were going to make mistakes and we needed to be able to address those. There was also, this was also a space for us to find comfort in validation whenever that was needed. At some point or another, as a supervisor, you're going to have a moment where you wonder if you're losing your mind, if you're completely misreading a situation, if you're actually the villain in the situation when you think you might be the good guy. Or for those of you who follow this account on Twitter or on Reddit, a lot of times these scenarios kind of feel like a classic AITA post, and I won't spell out that acronym, but if you know, you know. So, we just needed a group where we could bring these scenarios and situations and get much needed perspective and have someone tell you, no, you're not losing your mind. That's an awful situation. Or have a colleague tell you, yeah, actually, you might want to rethink how you approach that. So this community of practice was very much that space for all of us.
Okay, so what did our community practice look like, the logistics of it? So we met once a month, but sometimes we would meet in between time. So sometimes every 2 weeks or so if needed. And the duration of our meetings was at least an hour, sometimes an hour and a half. I think there was one time where it may have gone 2, but it just kind of depends on what was going on. We would always meet outside the library building. Most often we would go to the faculty cafe, which was in a neighboring building on campus, or we would go to Kruger Grounds, which is a local coffee spot on campus. And then our meetings were typically, or were really organic. And not necessarily pre-planned, but typically the topics focused on whatever issues or deadlines or topics were on our mind during that specific time. And then we sometimes would bring topics from discussions we had had with our mentors.
So logistics are really important in developing a community of practice, but so is the approach that you want to take towards building your community. So I was the last person to join this community of practice just by virtue of being the last person hired. And I knew that I wanted to bring in my perspective and experience with relational cultural theory to the group. So this theory informs a lot of my own work. And really what it is a feminist approach to human interaction and development. It believes that we all kind of grow through and towards relationships. And we can find empowerment and personal growth through relationships. And I really like it for an approach to a community of practice because it assumes an openness, it assumes a state of equality, right? We're all kind of power sharing as opposed to lording power over one another. And it also really helps us become stronger as a group. Through relational cultural theory, you're also identifying ways in which your own sociocultural identity impacts the way others see you and the way that you present yourself. So things like race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, culture, class, all of that comes into play in terms of who you are as both a person, but in your relational role. So in our case, it would be other supervising coordinators or how we are in relation to the people that we supervise.
So being a BIPOC supervisor, I don't need to tell anyone here that BIPOC librarians continue to make up a very small percentage of the profession. And those numbers decrease drastically as you move up sort of like the management ladder or pyramid, depending on how you look at it. And that reality was always on our minds. And the fact that two of us were BIPOC women, we were mindful of what that meant in terms of representation. So in a library where the majority of librarian supervisors are white, other BIPOC librarians, at least within liaison services, the department which we were in, saw us as representatives of sort of forward progress. But there was still this underlying feeling of how to be successful in a system still plagued by the white supremacist foundations.
Yeah, and just kind of building off of what Andrea was saying, you know, in our community of practice, we're acutely aware of that kind of white supremacist work culture that permeates all colleges and universities, right? It's the foundation upon which these institutions and their systems were built. And we wanted our meetings to be a time and space where we could call out these issues in our workplace to one another and not feel like we had to stay silent or feel like we were going to be doubted or attacked. So I'm gonna put Lisa on the spot here and say that we consider Lisa to be an ally and in many ways our unofficial control in the workplace. And I know that sounds kind of awkward and maybe a little bit silly, but it can be so helpful to have a real ally in your community of practice who can say things like, yeah, as a white woman, I never experienced that. Or yeah, I went through that too. That's not unique to your experience as a Latina or your experience as a Black woman. And it really helped us determine which scenarios and situations warranted further scrutiny and action, and which ones were maybe not as related to other parts of our identities.
So we were, as a community of practice, really motivated to avoid replicating the white supremacist work culture, which we knew was problematic in hierarchical library organizations like our own. I was particularly aware of this dynamic as a white supervisor of two then early career librarians who were BIPOC. So I was acutely aware of how easily I could fall into this structure, more easily than resisting it in a lot of ways. So we don't talk enough, I think, about the replication of systems of supremacy in this profession and the ways in which our actions, our individual actions, can perpetrate systemic sort of cultures that, in fact, we individually want to change. So this was, that's a fairly heavy topic for a community of practice, but it came out in very practical ways. So in our community of practice, we talked through situations where those power dynamics reared their heads, as Ronnie mentioned, and it was actually fairly often, frankly. And we talked about it from both sides of the power dynamic. Because we were supervisors, all of us supervised, across color lines, if you will, which is a terrible phrase. But I supervised librarians of color, Ronnie supervised a librarian of color, Andrea herself, a librarian of color, supervised other people who are librarians of color. So we all had situations where we had the power and situations where others did. So these conversations were invaluable for all of us. And sometimes there were times when I could say, hey, this water that we're swimming in, yeah, that sounds pretty problematic, pretty racist. And here's what I see as the underlying thing. And sometimes the conversations were, hey, Lisa, that's pretty problematic. You need to think about this, because I'm definitely not immune. And it was a really great check for all of us, to see and to listen to what are these power dynamics and how can we think about them in a way that's really deliberate and really mindful.
So all of that is really heavy, right? It weighs on you, right? But I want to, share that, and with those types of conversations, plus with everything else that goes on that you deal with as a supervisor, we all have bumps along the way. As we were developing our supervisory styles, navigating new and changing relationships, learning HR policies, procedures. And there were times for each of us when we felt like we just couldn't do this anymore. It was the pressure, y'all. Whether that was from self-doubt, whether that was from external pressure, or a combination of the both. The struggle was real. So, but however, all of that to say that we really did encourage one another. The encouragement and support we gave one another helped tremendously, to sustain us, to keep us moving forward and let us know that we could be and we would be successful as new managers.
Okay, so that was our approach to our community of practice. But one thing we thought you would also find helpful is learning about how our community of practice actually functioned, right? So like what a typical meetup would look like. And the one that always comes to mind for me when I think about our COP is the one that we had and continue to have right around annual review time. So our library has an annual performance review process that kind of like wraps up every December. And that includes really standard things like self-reports and goal progress and feedback from supervisors, both written and verbally in person. So this is a super stressful process for librarians and supervisors alike. And as a new supervisor, I personally knew that I needed help. So we received good help and guidance from our department head, but it was also really nice to kind of talk amongst the three of us for additional advice and feedback. And we'll talk about this later, where you really have to kind of be careful with HR concerns and confidentiality. And we will definitely talk about that because that's certainly an issue. But we would talk about things like, what kind of language are you using in your written supervisor feedback? How did you apply that performance review rubric, which none of us like, but we all have to use? Did you give somebody a half a point, a full point, a quarter point? Things like, how did you approach your in-person conversation, right? Like, how did you lead off? How did the conversation go? How do you redirect it? So these are all the kind of like small interpersonal things that matter a lot in performance reviews, and they also matter a lot in your relationship as a supervisor to the people you supervise. So it's really important to kind of get that feedback from peers and colleagues who are going through the same process.
So the pandemic ruined everything is the title on this slide, and we're only mostly kidding. But we did want to address the pandemic, especially if you are thinking about yourselves starting a community of practice, since you most likely be doing so virtually. So when the pandemic hit, we found that we needed our community of practice more than ever. But we also found that it was harder to meet than ever due to the pandemic. So logistically speaking, we moved our community of practice from a campus coffee spot to FaceTime, and we set a standing Friday afternoon appointment. Despite caregiving concerns and new work duties and the sheer stress of the pandemic, we met nearly every week for the first 6 months of the pandemic. As we adjusted from that first crisis phase, we met less frequently, but we still made our community of practice a priority. And believe me, it was not easy at times trying to find the energy and the time in our schedules to do it. Thematically speaking, we wrestled with really big challenges like leave policies under COVID-19, maintaining our team's morale and motivation from the switch to in-person to online, and of course, the pandemic, caring for ourselves and our families in healthy balance and boundaries with the people we supervised, and the widespread, very critical Black Lives Matter protests and police brutality and killings from last summer. So there were tears and anger and moments of really deep frustration with each other and with circumstances. But there were also moments of encouragement and joy and excitement. We were really able to hold each other up, which I think is something that cannot be disregarded. Without the learning and perspective and friendship gained from our community of practice, we would have struggled with how to handle the last year. So you have heard our thoughts on why we did this, but in this slide, we bring together our thoughts on why you should do this, or at least consider it. So the first reason is, as a boss, you have fewer peers. You heard our keynote on Monday call it positional isolation. That often translates to fewer friends and friendships at work because of that power dynamic. If you were a peer and now you're a new supervisor, people who were your peers are going to feel a little strange about continuing the friendship in the same way. And if you walk into a new organization as a new supervisor, as Ronnie did, and as I'm doing now, then you find that those friendships never develop in quite the same way. And that's completely understandable. Those power dynamics are real. So the answer is, as a new manager or supervisor, you need to find your peers, whether inside or outside your organization, with whom you can talk things through. So the next thing that a community of practice for new managers or supervisors does is it provides space to game out situations, options, feelings, responses without immediately triggering action from your supervisor or human resources. Before you trigger that formal response, you want to get your thoughts in order. The last thing is that the more advice and perspective you can gain as you're putting your thoughts in order, the better off you are. So you will undoubtedly have problems, challenges, etc. as a new supervisor. If you are a new supervisor, you're already starting to see them. So the advice and perspective from external people helps ease that, am I the one? Is this me? Feeling, which can be part of that positional isolation.
Okay, I feel like I'm clicking on everything as we're talking, so excuse us if we have pauses here and there. Okay, so we absolutely see the value in communities of practice for ourselves and others, but we also recognize that these groups are not without their complications. And part of the reason I was a little delayed in clicking is that I was looking at the Q&A, and I feel like all of the Q&A questions are about things that we either wrestled with during the process of like actually having our community of practice, or afterwards when something would happen and we would be like, oh yeah, we should have considered that. So we're going to use this time for you to really learn from our mistakes, I guess, or from the things that we wish we had done, and offer a few things for you to keep in mind as you work towards developing your own community of practice. And I promise we'll get to your questions. So we think that community agreements are really important in cultivating a community of practice that is healthy and balanced. So if you're not familiar with the concept of community agreements, they are just a set of agreed upon expectations and behaviors that allow everyone in the group to participate to their fullest ability and desire to do so. So they're not meant to be rules, but they are agreed upon and developed by the entire group as a set kind of foundation for sharing and growth. So we did not have a community of practice in place for our group. And a lot of that came from us thinking, we're small, it's just the three of us, we know each other, we like each other, we're friends, we'll be fine. However, you know, we had moments of disagreement, moments of miscommunication, and moments of conflict amongst the three of us that happen in any group and really happen in any kind of relational situation. And we worked through those by then identifying aspects of our group that we wish we had like set aside in community agreements. So had we had that agreement to begin with, that's not to say that this conflict would not have still like come up, but we could have at least maybe pointed to the agreement or resolved that conflict faster than we did by not having one at all. So again, community agreements, they're great, highly recommend them. And I'll see if I can put a link in the chat to a good source for drafting community agreements.
So in terms of confidentiality, this may be the most difficult area when participating in this type of community practice. While we gather to support and empower one another, we had to keep in mind the confidentiality associated with being a manager. You must remember to adhere to HR policies and rules when having discussions. As a result, there may be things that you simply cannot share to keep the personnel matters of your supervisees private. And that can be a little bit frustrating when you're trying to get advice or help find a solution to a challenging personnel matter or personnel concerns. So with that in mind, you'll just have to be really creative and thoughtful about how you address and discuss HR issues within your community of practice.
So a lot of times librarians want to provide solutions to what they perceive as problems. It's what we do. But it's important to understand in a given situation, whether your community of practice colleague is looking for you to listen or for you to provide feedback. It is helpful for them to state it outright or for your community agreement to address this. But if that doesn't happen and you're unsure in the moment, we've found that you should ask directly. It certainly helps avoid conflict. So venting people do not want helpful solutions, not in the moment. They want to vent. And we recognize that it's healthy to vent. There were times when we all needed to do so. So it's important to make space for that moment where it's just listening, that moment where the person is just venting. And it's also important not just to listen, but to speak up when it's your turn. And this is something that we went back and forth on. You know, some points someone has a bigger problem and someone has maybe a smaller problem. It's important to consider how you want to take turns and how you want each person to participate. And it's something that you want to make sure you're not just listening, you're not just offering feedback, you're also participating. So that's part of this consideration as well.
Okay, lastly, it's important to consider how your group may be perceived by others. And there was a question in the Q&A that kind of addresses this or asks about this. And I'll just read the question out. It was, how do you keep the COP from being clubby or exclusionary? Or would you just let anyone join? Does everyone in your library know about it, or could they find out easily? So it's on our calendars. Everyone can see our calendars. They know that we meet together as a community of practice. We are in these very unique supervising coordinator positions. And we're kind of the only ones in this odd, like middling, not quite middle manager position. So in many ways, we were like our only peers within the organization. The case could be made that there are a few other folks in other departments, but really positionally, we were pretty unique. And that's why we ended up kind of forming this community of practice of 3. And for us, our organization had, as Lisa mentioned earlier, had a culture of communities of practice, and the idea of learning communities was not foreign to people. But I think the bigger issue, and one that we noticed, is that there are always going to be questions when a group of supervisors come together to meet, right? I once had a colleague at another institution who, upon stepping into a supervisory position, talked about how suddenly all of their words and actions carried a totally different weight. You know, and I think that this is absolutely true, right? A group of colleagues meeting together, it doesn't signify the same thing to other people as a group of managers who meet together. And it's important to take that into account when discussing your community of practice with others in your organization, right? Letting people know, like, this community of practice, it's just for professional support, right? It's for being able to kind of like game out situations, but it's not decision making, right? We don't make decisions that are going to impact other people in our community of practice. Because I think there is that tendency to be like, well, what are all those supervisors doing meeting together? Are they talking about me? Are they making decisions about the work that we're going to do? And I think that's a really natural assumption that you have to kind of tackle head on. And it was also one of the reasons why we always chose to meet outside of the library. We didn't want to like unduly stress out colleagues, like, oh, there they are, they're meeting again. But we also wanted to maintain a sense of confidentiality about what we were discussing. So we tried to find spaces where we could just speak and not contribute to anyone else's discomfort within the library. If that makes sense. And hopefully that answers your question, Anna. Cool. Okay. So we wanted to give you a chance, because we've been talking a fair amount, to identify ways that you could establish your own community of practice. And to do that, we have 2 different kind of activities planned out, because we're all 3 of us are kind of like instruction and reference librarians by trade, so we can't help ourselves. And what we have done is put together a Padlet where we can brainstorm as a group. And I have the link up, but I'm also going to put it in the chat. And here's where things get interesting. I'm going to try and pull up the Padlet. Can folks see the Padlet? Okay. All right, so some of the questions that we have for you today are the following. What are some networks that you can use to identify other manager, supervisor peers? And what you can do is just click on the plus sign underneath the questions and leave your own brainstorm comment. The second question is, what would you want to be the focus of a new manager or new supervisor community of practice? And you can brainstorm some of those ideas there. And our last question is, what are some next steps that you want to take after leaving today to create your own community of practice? And our goal with that last question is to really get us started on thinking about how to take some of the things we discussed today and turn them into action. So I am going to take a look here and try and scroll through, but it looks like most people are able to access the Padlet. And so some of the networks that we see are like peers on campus outside of the library, which we didn't even get to yet, but it's also super important. Other peer institutions, professional organizations, Twitter, also helpful. Llama, now core discussion groups, listservs, employee research groups. Yeah, we here for BIPOC managers or supervisors can be really, really helpful. And in terms of focus, yeah, addressing problematic behaviors, fostering helpful behaviors is super beneficial. Dealing with toxic administration could also benefit. Okay. Yeah, letting go of projects and delegating. Gosh, I want to go to all of these communities of practice. I'm like, yeah, this would be great. How to facilitate positive change. Okay, so as this is still continuing, the other thing I'm going to do is to share a spreadsheet. So we didn't want to let go of the opportunity that this conference in particular presents to be able to meet and network with peers. And so in addition to this Padlet, which you'll all have access to after the presentation, we also put together a spreadsheet, and I'll put the link in the chat. And hopefully that showed up for everyone. And I'll pull it up on the screen too. Okay, so this spreadsheet just, if you choose to do so, presents a space for you to leave your name and contact information, your time zone, your desired practice, so that you can help identify other folks at this conference who might want to get together and form a community of practice. Chances are we're all here because we're kind of in the same boat. So we thought we would leave this as a space for you to connect with one another. So that's there. And we'll give you all some time to fill that out. Now I look like that TikTok video of the professor who's like sharing his screen and talking to himself, but we will stop this just now. Okay, so while that is going, I will switch over to the next slide. Just to say thanks. And again, here is our contact information. You are welcome to contact us via Twitter or email after this presentation, but we also have some time, I believe, Lori, for questions and discussion.
Great. So I'll go ahead and start reading through the questions. So someone has asked, I work in an org that would be resistant to this type of group and would require administrative permission. How would you advise advocating for that?
So I'm still thinking about it. I think we all have our thinking face on, but I guess my question is your organization open to like learning and growth and professional development in a way that you could frame it around that lens? I guess if the threat is time, or if the threat is individual people, maybe that could be addressed by framing it as either outside the organization, peers, or again, that professional development. This isn't about me chit-chatting, it's about me learning and growing as a professional. So
yeah, I really like that, Lisa. Like maybe sharing as you're advocating for it, like a focus, right? Like this community of practice, we've agreed that we'll focus on these things. This is an opportunity for free professional development, right? With all of our budgets just going down and down and down, this could be an opportunity to get much needed professional development and not have to spend a lot of money on it. Could also be maybe a selling point.
Yeah, I would agree. I would think if an organization is opposed to you growing professionally, there's a bigger issue than just creating a community of practice.
And so there was also a related question about how supportive your administration was regarding the creation of this, what this person is framing as an emotional intelligent group, or how you framed it as a community of practice group.
sure. So I think Andrea and I can both speak to that. I spoke a little bit about it in the Q&A, but this is something which emotional intelligence as a learning area actually came from departmental leaders who later became administrators. So there was absolutely an interest in emotional intelligence, and our department head at the time said, why don't you put this together as a community of practice? And happy to go into more detail. It was really something which came together kind of beautifully and was of its moment. But it's also, we do talk about it in the article, which we mentioned earlier, and sort of what was the organizational structure and how did it work and who supported it. And in fact, the department at the time was a key champion, which is one reason why it moved forward. And I'm thinking about folks whose administrators may not be as keen on communities of practice. And again, besides thinking about that professional development framing, I'm going to have to reflect a bit and see if there's other ideas. It's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I think we were fortunate that I think Ronnie just put in the chat there. It's part of our strategic plan. See, our organization valued those things. So for us, it wasn't difficult because it was something that they sort of wanted people to grow and learn and know. So.
Yeah, and there was, looks like Jennifer McGillen in the chat also talked about another perspective you could take, and this is a great idea, is advocating for a community of practice as a retention tool, right? So being able to keep people in those positions who can then do a better job keeping people in the positions they supervise. So all of that can contribute to less turnover.
So you talked a bit about how you handled confidentiality and things like that. There was also a question about how you handled sensitive issues, which I think you may have touched on, but if there's anything else you'd like to add to that. I was also curious if there were certain kind of ground rules that you all had established when approaching some of the more kind of case study aspects of your discussions.
I don't know if we set ground rules, but we were always very careful. A lot of, like I mentioned, some of the things we just couldn't share because our department was so intimate. Like we needed to respect the privacy of the people within our department. And so because we knew each other so well, people on each other's teams, we all worked together very collaboratively. So it just, sometimes like the things we couldn't share within the COP, depending on the reporting lines, you might discuss with the department head, but within the COP, we just couldn't address those issues. So depending on how the structure of your organization is, those may be things that you can take directly to your supervisor or however those within HR, those people who you can discuss those things with. But within the community of practice, we just we just didn't go there for fear of, breaking a rule that you shouldn't discuss those things with anyone outside of your direct supervisee.
Yeah, and I think we were pretty good about kind of talking generally about things. So I think one thing that everyone struggled with during those initial weeks and like first few months of COVID was just motivation and morale, right? Ourselves included. So it's like, how do we keep it going? How do we keep people working? Which is such a terrible question to ask when, it's a worldwide pandemic. But at the same time, it's like, well, we recognize we're not going to be working the same way. So like, what do we do? What does it look like to work now? What is being compassionate? What is healthy? What are healthy expectations for us to have as managers of the people that we supervise? So those are the kind of things that you can talk about that have direct applicability to your work, but that don't like call anyone out in particular.
So we've got another question. Would you put community agreements into a strategic plan? Oh, my screen just jumped. Where professional development and presumably communities of practice were written in or advocated for, or would you consider that to be too restricting long-term?
Yeah, the community agreement should come from the community of practice. Lots of communities in there. So it's something that the group decides for itself when the group gets together, right? It's something that everybody contributes to and shapes, and that everyone is responsible for adhering to, or for calling people out if they don't adhere to it, or calling people in, however you want to do it.
Yeah, it's sort of akin to like, if everyone's familiar with meeting norms, right? Like you have different committees or groups and you set up those norms for those specific things, those specific gatherings. So yeah, it would be the same thing for community agreement, I think.
And it's important to consider that each community has a slightly different, or should probably have a slightly different set of agreements. We had a friendship that we could base ourselves off of. So how we would have and probably should have shaped our community agreements looks a little different than if you're, using the spreadsheet to come together with folks who you don't know. There's some just different needs there. I do think something like professional development, that's something that we at Houston, in some more general terms, had put into our strategic plan. So a recognition that part of staff excellence was an ability to keep professional development, keep growing, keep learning. So if you're talking about an all library strategic plan, there's definitely a role for something like learning, growing, maybe a community practice. That might be, I think, too narrow, but it's definitely worth considering. We're talking about a large library. So if you're talking about a smaller one, you might find that something more specific actually makes sense for you.
I also have sort of a logistical question. I was struck by the fact that you went to FaceTime, I think you said, once you were working remotely. And given all of the tools at our disposal these days, I'm curious how you went about making that decision and if there have been any drawbacks to that particular choice.
I did it because oh, go ahead, Lisa.
No, I think we're laughing because
it was all because we couldn't get, that was the only technology all three of us could get to work at any given time so that all three of us could talk to each other. Like, for some, Teams slowed down my computer, and then like Lisa couldn't use Skype, and then Andrea was also having Skype issues, and so FaceTime was like the only thing that worked. And remember, this is like early days of everybody working from home, so our networks were super pressed, and I think, yeah, FaceTime was just it for us.
Very understandable. So I think we've gotten to the questions as well as some of the comments in the chat. I don't know, certainly if folks have other questions, feel free to put that in, but I don't know if our panelists have any other thoughts that they'd like to share today.
Just that we will share our presentation slides using whatever mechanism Calm will have to share our presentation slides, but we'll also probably share them out on Twitter. So I will see if I can get that back up.
There's
So
one
that,
more question, ladies.
oh, okay.
It says, as a new supervisor, I focus mostly understanding my team's needs, but it sounds like a COP could help you understand the roles, pressures, etc. of other departments, meeting norms and large library. Did you build in other information exchanges, or was the focus more on staffing needs? Do you need me to read it again?
Yeah,
I think our focus was more on our individual, the people we supervise, our individual situations, we were sort of navel gazing, I guess, if you will. We certainly, as I think we gained more comfort, we thought across the organization, but at least for a while there, we were pretty focused on sort of head down challenges, which I think is partially a new job thing. And I see Ronnie's considering face.
Yeah, I'm reading the question and I wonder how clear we were in that. So we're all supervising coordinators, or we were, right, of a team, right? I supervised an instruction team, Lisa supervised an outreach team, Andrea supervises a research services team, but we were all within the same department. It's kind of an odd structure, but it's what we got. So I think if I'm reading your question correctly, I think it did help us see what it helped me from an instruction perspective, see what concerns were in terms of outreach, in terms of research services, to find out what everybody was working on, which I think we would have found out anyway, because we did, we meet as a department, we met with our department head, but having that community of practice kind of brings a lot of that work to the surface. And so I could see how, if you had a community of practice with people from other departments, or for people who led other kinds of teams, it could help familiarize you with the work of those teams and the kind of issues that might be shared across functional areas, if I'm reading that question correctly.
Andrea?
well, I'm thinking in terms of, because research services, like we had our community practice, but the team I managed also worked collaboratively with librarians in another department outside of our department. And I think having our COP helped me to, because those two groups getting together, there were often times where I would meet with the members of my team within liaison services who had questions about how to work with that other research team, right? That bigger group. And so having the COP, even though like librarians within that other department weren't part of our COP, they didn't have the same sort of structure that we had, that our COP helped me to help my people in the work that they were doing with others outside of our department. So, because the team I was supervising were all new hires. They came into our library, not knowing our structure, not knowing our environment. And so I had to, kind of manage them to learn within our department, but also then work outside of our department with other librarians.
And that actually, I'll mention briefly, that makes sense because outreach, the team that I was in charge of, was so externally focused that we did information share, but it makes sense that Ronnie and Andrea experienced it a little differently because the focus of their teams were different. So in short, large library org structures, if there's more communication happening, I think that's just a good thing, only to the better.
Well, not seeing any other questions, want to thank our panelists. This was a fantastic presentation. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure that our attendees did as well. Does anyone want to say any just kind of final remarks before we close out our session?
Before we get away, moving forward, like Lisa is now at a different institution. We miss her terribly, but we still plan to get together and continue our meetings and our sort of an RCOP. Because we've established a really good relationship. And so.
Yes, it's definitely possible, even if you start, a COP in one institution and people move on as people do. If it's a good thing, then why not? Why not keep it going? And I think these women have been fantastic and so helpful. And I call out a happy one to Carrie Creelman, who is in the call today and who is our supervisor, all three of us. Only good things to say.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for your contributions to the Padlet and to the spreadsheet. I hope the spreadsheet really helps you find other people to connect with after our presentation today.
Absolutely.
Well, great. Thank you all very much, and wishing everyone a wonderful rest of the day.
Right. Thank you all.
Thank you.